Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Robbie Mahood. This is a meeting of Montreal Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste, Socialist Action, and I am going to present the first part of the meeting, which is an educational, and the topic is China and the Uyghur question. So I'll get going with that. We're going to have discussion afterwards, and then we move to a business meeting of the Montreal branch. So at the center of the diplomatic, trade, and public relations offensive by the Western powers against China is the alleged maltreatment of the Uyghur minority in the westernmost Chinese province of Xinjiang. Xinjiang covers 18% of China's landmass, but it has a population of only 27 million out of the 1.5 billion in China as a whole. 48% of Xinjiang's population are Uyghurs, down from 80% in 1949. Han Chinese constitute another 40% after several decades of steady in-migration. The remainder are other Muslim minorities, Mongols, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and Tajiks. Xinjiang is 12th of the 31 Chinese provinces in terms of per capita income, which is all the more impressive, keeping in mind that several wealthier provinces are located in the favored southeast coastal region. There are substantial reserves of oil, coal, and gas, and Xinjiang is a significant exporter of cotton. The province constitutes China's western frontier, with a long border along several other Central Asian nations, many of whom speak languages of Turkish origin and/or share a Muslim heritage with the Uyghurs. Xinjiang, or as it is sometimes referred to, East Turkestan, was incorporated into China during the Qing dynasty in the 18th century. It has remained an outlying province of China ever since, except for brief periods in which the indigenous Uyghurs asserted their sovereignty, notably in the 19th century, and again in the 1930s and 40s during the Chinese Civil War. It was as a concession to this contested reality that in 1957, Mao Zedong named the province the Xinjiang Autonomous Uyghur Region. Paradoxically, it's the modern economic and social development of Xinjiang, promoted by Beijing, that has solidified a Uyghur sense of national identity, and with that, a sense of grievance. Xinjiang occupies a key place in China's Belt and Road Initiative as a strategic transport corridor to Central and South Asia. And by the same token, it looms large in Western imperialist ambitions to counter Russia's and China's influence in the region and allow the West to assert a dominant position. The Western media and political leaders allege genocide with suppression of the Uyghur language and culture, closure of mosques, police surveillance, and suppression of dissent. This includes separation of families, alleged slave labor, and the mass incarceration of Uyghurs in re-education camps. Claims that 1 million Uyghurs are imprisoned in concentration camps are common in the Western media. Beijing denies the charges, while conceding that it is concerned to stop the spread of radical Islamic fundamentalism responsible for a series of bombings and assassinations in Xinjiang. China cites a big improvement in living standards for the Uyghur population. What the West calls concentration camps, Beijing claims are re-education facilities to improve skills and career opportunities for Uyghurs and to inoculate them against extremism. China points out that Uyghurs are free to practice Islam and speak their language. Furthermore, some measures favoring Uyghurs have been introduced, such as preferential admission to universities and relaxation for Uyghurs, but not Han Chinese, of the one-child per family policy. It is admittedly difficult to arrive at firm conclusions about what is actually happening in Xinjiang. Even so, I will venture some opinions. First of all, I don't accept the characterization of China's treatment of its Uyghur minority as genocidal. The claim of 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps would mean that 1 in 12 Uyghurs are imprisoned. This is not credible. What about lower levels of repression? Several years ago, Xinjiang saw a small wave of terrorist attacks by Islamic fundamentalists. These have subsided, but Beijing continues to cite the terrorist threat as justification for a strike hard, maximum pressure approach. Despite relaxation of this policy, it would be surprising if the authorities did not continue to see Muslims along a potential pathway to radicalization. Of course, as well, China is concerned to preserve its historic claim to Xinjiang and block any move towards separation. The propaganda war, of course, has been fierce over the nature and scope of the re-education centers opened in Xinjiang. By Beijing's own admission, residents are given vocational and language training, as well as political re-education. Who are targeted? Well, possibly dissident intellectuals and artists, party members deemed disloyal, or Muslims who are excessively pious or suspected of Islamic fundamentalist views. Are incarcerations time limited? And what happens on discharge? We simply don't have reliable information. The same can be said about the claim that Uyghur children are separated from their parents and placed in boarding schools, and the allegation that Uyghurs from rural areas are sent to the Chinese interior to work in factories linked to the supply chains of Western corporations. There is no way of knowing how Uyghur political opinion divides between integration or even assimilation into the majority Han society versus outright separation at the other extreme, or just a larger degree of autonomy for Xinjiang. Perhaps the majority of Uyghurs favor the latter option, but this is speculation. Beijing is clearly worried about growing separatist sentiment. For the moment, militant separatism is largely confined to the exiled Uyghur community, from which the CIA and the State Department draw their recruits for the anti-Chinese campaign. In this, they are aided by right-wing extremists, such as the shadowy German-American evangelical Christian, Adrian Zenz. China's approach to its Uyghur minority includes both repression and accommodation. Substantial state investment in Xinjiang has improved incomes and education, from which Uyghurs have benefited, even if there is still a shortfall compared to the Han population. Efforts have been made as well to increase Uyghur representation in the civil service and to recruit more Uyghurs to the Communist Party. There has been some decentralization of power to local governments. It would be useful, of course, to have more information on the status of the Uyghur language in schools and in the media in Xinjiang. These questions are often left unaddressed in the competing narratives. But taking this into account as a whole, it's difficult to square this policy with that of genocide. Whether China will be able to stabilize its restive Western province remains to be seen. Resentment among Uyghurs will continue to be fueled by the influx of Han Chinese migrants, especially in the cities. This unchecked migration poses a linguistic and a cultural challenge to the Uyghur presence. For the foreseeable, those Uyghurs who wish to assert their rights must contend with a powerful central Chinese state, for which Xinjiang is a vital strategic asset. There is no sign of a limit to Han Chinese migration to Xinjiang, or that Beijing will grant a greater degree of autonomy to the province. Nor has China shown much concern for environmental degradation in Xinjiang, linked to cotton monoculture and exploitation of fossil fuels. It's notable that the subterranean aquifers of the province are shrinking. Nature will set its own limit on the Xinjiang model of state-driven development. Now, I want to now move on to the question of what are the obligations of the left in Canada and other imperialist countries. As socialists in the imperialist heartland, and I include Canada in that, our principal obligation is to oppose the aggressive and predatory policy of our own ruling class. That is in line with a time-honored principle of socialist internationalism, the policy of revolutionary defeatism, first formulated by Luxemburg, by Lenin, Sylvia Pankhurst, John Maclean, James Connolly, and other working class leaders during the First World War, as the Second International was being torn apart. The charge of genocide in Xinjiang is a reflection of the hysteria in the Western media and political elites, and their decision to launch a new Cold War. Canada's hypocrisy was underscored by the discovery of mass graves of missing Indigenous children at church-run residential schools only weeks after the House of Commons voted to denounce China as a perpetrator of genocide. The truth is that genocidal policies directed at the Indigenous population were foundational in the construction of the white settler colonial states, notably the United States, Canada, and Australia. The same cannot be said of China, even if ethnic or national oppression exists, as in the case of the Uyghurs. But the charge of genocide is spurious. We should oppose every effort to ramp up hostility towards China and generate a warlike atmosphere. This means opposing the trade war and sanctions and the detention and threatened extradition of Huawei CEO Meng Wanzhou. We should be in the front ranks, opposing anti-Asian racism and denouncing any pandering to this latent sentiment in the white settler colonial population of North America. This should be our main priority. The US and its imperialist allies are trying to counter China's growing power internationally. Biden's policy follows that of Trump, but with a liberal humanitarian gloss. Biden has replaced Trump's bluster by projecting a, quote, rules-based international order, close quotes, to which China must submit. Of course, the rules are established and interpreted by Washington and its close allies, which includes Canada, the UK, and Australia. China's naive response has been to champion the United Nations and the relationship between sovereign states, including reviving the slogan of peaceful coexistence from the Soviet era. Of course, the Western media never talks about this. Instead, China is painted in the darkest and most menacing of shades. Nevertheless, a question is posed. Should we not line up with the humanitarian left, who are disturbed by the plight of the Uyghurs and want to rush to their defense? As Owen Jones put it in an opinion piece in The Guardian, quote, "We should not sacrifice oppressed Muslims on the altar of geopolitics," close quotes. This is a seductive argument, but a dangerous one, in my view. It risks providing a left cover for Western imperialism's main game, which is to demonize and isolate anyone who presents a challenge to its political and economic domination. Anti-imperialist politics cannot be centered on a perennial search for the moral high ground. Self-righteousness and virtue signaling are no substitute for finding the most effective way to discredit and undermine the aggressive foreign policy of our own rulers and stop their present-day wars or those they may precipitate in the future. In other words, it is necessary to concentrate on the underlying disease and not on this or that morbid symptom. The anti-war and socialist left cannot control how its support for humanitarian causes is understood by the broader public. We have nothing like the capacity of the corporate and Western state media to shape public opinion. Experience shows that naive arguments that seek balance between what seem like two unsavory alternatives can be quickly co-opted into a cover for the richer and more powerful side, leading to another savage act of imperialist aggression and war. We saw that in Iraq, we saw it in Libya, and again in Syria, with devastating consequences for the local populations. And we saw it also before that in the bombing of Serbia. A part of the left became, in each of these cases, a part of the left became obsessed with autocrats like Hussein, Gaddafi, and Assad, or Milosevic, and they lost sight of the bigger picture. In China, the stakes are that much higher. not excluding the possibility of a nuclear confrontation. We want to avoid, therefore, giving, even obliquely, a stamp of approval to the confrontational course set by our rulers. Anti-imperialist and anti-war activism must move beyond good intentions. We need to reflect on where we can have the most beneficial impact. We can acknowledge injustice or repression in China and Russia, but we are not in a position to influence politics in those countries. Our task, rather, is to concentrate our small forces here in the imperialist heartland with the aim of mobilizing broad layers of the population who, whatever their views on the regime in China or in Russia, do not want war and will come to oppose the belligerent policies of our rulers. That will require particular attention to exposing the humanitarian posturing of politicians like Justin Trudeau or Joe Biden. We should vigorously contest the anti-Chinese and anti-Russian demagogy of the West, but at the same time, it will not help to build an anti-war and anti-imperialist movement by echoing or simply echoing the line of Beijing or Moscow. Exposing Western arrogance, bullying, and hypocrisy is a top priority. At the same time, we must maintain our political independence for reasons both of principle and expediency. We wish to build the broadest anti-intervention and anti-war movement possible. There are important differences within the socialist and Marxist left concerning the nature of the contemporary Chinese state. Is China capitalist, or does it retain aspects of a transitional society not yet fully capitalist? And if China is capitalist, is it also imperialist? I did not venture into these questions because of insufficient time, but also because I don't believe it changes our approach to the Uyghur question. Now, speaking personally, I am sympathetic to the minority view in the Marxist left that China is not fully capitalist, let alone imperialist. I hasten to add that my organization, Socialist Action, Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste, does support the analysis that China is capitalist. For me, this is an analytical question, an empirical question, if you like, rather than one of principle, and it should be clarified, I think, in the fullness of time. And I'm certainly prepared to change my position, as I hope other socialists are. In summary, I would say that there is a case to be made for the national oppression of the Uyghur people of China, but not that they are victims of genocide. A further point is that the resolution of Uyghur grievances does not lie in an alliance with imperialism, nor in an appeal to liberal and social democratic opinion in the West. The danger is that Uyghurs who seek change will be pushed into the arms of imperialism. There are many examples of oppressed nations allying with Western powers who use them for their own short-term interests before ultimately abandoning them. Rather, the fate of the Uyghurs is tied to social and political developments in the People's Republic of China. The Western powers are vainly trying to return China to its subordinate position in the global capitalist order. The Uyghurs have nothing to gain from being a pawn in Washington's game. At the same time, the Chinese Communist Party has not and will not be able to keep the lid on social unrest and class struggles, including agitation by oppressed minorities within China's borders. Well, that brings me to the conclusion of my remarks, and I think we'll go on to the question and answer period. Thank you.
Barry, are you chairing?
I can if you wish.
Well, either you or somebody else.
All right, let's not belabor the point. I'd like to invite people to ask a question or make a comment. We'll try to have a gender balanced list, although there seems to be only one contender for that potentially. And let's try to limit interventions to 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. I'll try to be flexible, but it would be great if we can get a number of comments, and then we'll go back to Robbie, maybe after 2 or 3 each round. I'm also very happy to see that we've got 2 folks here from Alberta who may not know each other yet, but Ethan, who's working in the construction industry in Calgary, although he's from Ontario, and Justin, who I believe is in Edmonton, and who just had an exciting intervention into the Alberta NDP convention there in a few days or weeks ago. And he's concerned about the future of the workers' movement in Alberta, as are we all. So with that welcome, let me say, who would like to speak first?
I suppose I could say something, Barry.
Okay, Roy, but you have to speak up because your audio is very low.
Yes, I bought a cheap Zoom camera and the audio is low. During Robbie's discussion in the second half, he did point out that there are groups in China that want to advance and want to promote. At the same time, the rest of the Western world, the capitalist world, will support them and make an issue of it and highlight it and bring it in the capitalist press all over the world. What do we as revolutionaries do when we know the real issue really wasn't that big? They're making a big issue out of it, like the suppression of the people, the section that we're talking about tonight. That's the question. What do we as revolutionaries do when, if the capitalist world supports a group there and fights for this in order to lead to eventually war with China, or a cold war with China, or a hot war with China? As revolutionaries, how do we address that?
Okay, thanks for your question, Roy. Let's take one or two more. Robbie did address your question in the course of his talk, but he may elaborate. While we're waiting for someone to signal that they want to speak, I failed to introduce myself for the purpose of the recording. So this is Barry Weisletter. I'm the Federal Secretary of Socialist Action, Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste. So who would like to intervene at this point?
Barry, with your permission, I can speak.
Abhishek, go ahead.
Yeah, good presentation, Robbie. I was wondering why we, Socialist Action Group, is a little hesitant to call it genocide, when in my opinion, it is genocide even by a very liberal definition, textbook definition. You know, I understand that we don't have to fall prey to the binarism between American imperialism and what's happening with Uyghurs. You know, if somebody else has called it genocide and we want to distance from them, we can take a very technical position by calling it genocide and also distancing ourselves from what's the ulterior agenda of these capitalist and imperialist powers. So why not we think about this very concretely?
Okay, then that's a question of whether genocide applies to the treatment of the Uyghurs in Northwest China. So we've had two questions. Roy asking about the appropriate socialist policy on this issue, and the question you just heard. Is there another comment or question? I may jump into the discussion myself. This is a privilege that the chair can exercise at will, it seems, if the audience will put up with it. But I'd like to hear from one other person.
Yeah, I got a question.
Bob in Kingston, go ahead.
Well, I agree with you, Robbie. Our primary orientation has to be to oppose imperialism here in the new Cold War that they're trying to engineer. But I'm not sure that needs to say that we don't say anything about the issue at hand, like in Nicaragua or Venezuela or China. There's a lot to criticize about the Chinese state. I mean, it's authoritarian. It's got the most sophisticated surveillance system in the world, and its policies in Xinjiang are more cultural assimilation. I mean, just trying to erase a problem by cultural assimilation. Yeah, give them some posts in university, but it's going to be in Han Chinese. And you know, if you've seen that BuzzFeed that just won a Pulitzer Prize, they have satellite images of the prisons going up. Well, you can call them prisons or education camps, but they got high walls and barbed wire. So, you know, I think if we did an article, you'd spend 95% of it opposing imperialist interventions, but we could have our own analysis of what's going on. Just a question.
Okay, we've heard three questions. Robbie, do you mind if I intervene, or do you want to handle
Go
those?
ahead. I'm never very good at fielding questions. I have a few thoughts, but they were good questions. I don't want to take anything away from them there.
Okay, well, let me give you a cushion, a little bit more time to ponder your answers while I say a few words myself. Well, first of all, in terms of Abhishek's question, genocide. On my father's side, in Europe, a good portion of my family was annihilated by the Nazis in the concentration camps of the 1940s. So the term, has a very vivid meaning to those of us who have more than a passing familiarity with it. Genocide is a deliberate policy to annihilate, that is to make to disappear from the face of the earth an identifiable group, a nation or ethnicity, or a religious group, an identifiable population. And the evidence, even taking it from the harshest critics of China, does not seem to support that evidence. And Robbie mentioned that. If there is a policy of genocide, that is physical annihilation, then there would be some evidence of the victims, the corpses. They would number in the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And if there was any evidence of this sort, we would know about it. It would be front page news everywhere. Its absence, I think, speaks volumes. Secondly, there is the population policy of the Chinese regime. For decades, there was a one-child-only policy, and more recently, two-child policy that attempted to curb the rapid expansion of the Chinese population. I think it's important to note that the one-child policy and then more laterally the two-child policy did not apply in Xinjiang. Did not apply. In other words, the Uyghur people could have as many children as they wanted to have. That doesn't seem to correspond to a policy of genocide, of physical annihilation of a nationality. It just doesn't jive. And when you combine with that freedom to religious expression, the use of the language, the culture, some of us have seen video footage of people traveling through Uyghur cities and towns, people in their national dress, people not cowering in the shadows for fear of being caught on video, in terms of repression that might be that might ensue. Now, having said that, the term genocide, in my humble opinion, does not apply in this case. Does not mean that there is not national discrimination or ethnic discrimination, and this shouldn't be a surprise. The Maoist regime that preceded the Deng and the present regime was notorious for great Han chauvinism. It was widely criticized, even when China was by most observers to be a degenerated worker state. The Stalinist policy of great Han chauvinism came down heavily on the people of Tibet, quite possibly the people in the Uyghur zone of the country, and other sections of the population, and of course in relation to Hong Kong. One does not have to be an advocate of imperialism or even free enterprise in Hong Kong style to oppose the crushing of democratic rights, the workers' rights. You can't form a union, a trade union, a labor union in China. You can't go on strike legally in China. There are unions, but they're instruments of the state, and by virtue of that, instruments of the employer class. So there's a problem. And with regard to the legacy of socialists in relation to this question, we can refer to, in terms of the danger of a breakaway from China, the slogan that Trotsky advanced in relation to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. He called for an independent socialist Ukraine. Even though a breakaway by the Ukraine from the Soviet Union would possibly pose the danger of capitalist restoration, but the heavy hand of the Stalinist bureaucracy and the desire for socialist democracy, not only in Ukraine, but in other of the Soviet republics, prompted him to argue that it was important to support self-organization from the bottom up, even where there is some risk of the imperialists gaining the upper hand as a result. One does not turn a blind eye to oppression in order to support a Stalinist regime on the basis that, well, at least it preserves socialist property relations, so we'll have to put up with the repression of the Stalinist dictatorship. Finally, I think Robbie's response in terms of the obligation of socialists was quite good and very balanced. The Socialist Action Convention didn't approve a resolution that proposed to ask for not only that the term genocide apply, but that Ottawa should apologize, and everyone who's critical of China should apologize for China because it plays a leading role in human rights on a world scale. Well, I think that's not a supportable position. But we do want to oppose strongly our imperialists who want to step up the Cold War into a hot war against China because they fear Chinese growing role in world markets. As a result, Socialist Action demands freedom from Meng Wanzhou. Meng Wanzhou is a chief financial officer for Huawei, a major tech firm. She's under house arrest in Vancouver now over 2 years, I think 2.5 years coming on. We don't, it's not because we have a soft spot for Huawei. It's an exploitative enterprise, but we're opposed to the Cold War agitation. We want to see the two Michaels freed, and they will be, I believe, if Meng is freed. And she's being held only because Washington maintains that she's guilty of violating U.S. trade policy, but U.S. trade policy, which prohibits commercial relations with Iran and certain other countries, is a violation of the United Nations rules and regulations with regard to this. So it's hypocritical for Washington to demand it, and rather disgusting for Ottawa to be complicit. So I'll stop there. And Robbie, do you want to respond to some of the comments others made?
I'll try. Can you hear me still?
Perfectly. Go ahead.
So, well, I think I pretty much agree with your qualification of and selective use of the term genocide. It really has to involve the deliberate attempt to annihilate a people. I guess there's a subsidiary question. Well, there's such a thing as cultural genocide, because it's kind of morphed into that particular aspect as well. But usually the two go together to some extent. Like, for instance, in the question of indigenous people in North America, there were both elements of certainly of a physical extermination, and there was also a concerted attempt to eliminate the culture and destroy the indigenous cultures. So I'm prepared to allow a little bit of leeway to the G word, but I do think that we should treat words like that with respect to their true intention and the scope of the injustice and criminality, really, of the enterprise we're addressing. And I really don't think that the Uyghur situation, although it may be unjust and involve oppression, it is not, in my opinion, genocidal, despite what the Western media likes to tout. Well, I think you know, it's a difficult question. I noticed that Ed Duranus had put in a comment, but I'm not very good at reading them. And I see there are some other hands up. So I'd rather have more discussion and hear what comrades have to say on this issue.
Thanks, Robbie. And that's what we'll do. We'll go to other folks, but I don't see hands.
I see one. Abhishek and Bob have a yellow hand in their boxes.
Okay, so I guess Bob and Abhishek want to go on a second round, which is fine. But I'll ask if there are any people on the first round before we go to those who've spoken before. Going once? Going twice? All right, then Abhishek and Roy, who wants to go first?
Oh, Ethan is on.
Oh, Ethan, okay. Then
First.
why don't we go to Ethan because he hasn't spoken to us yet. Ethan, can you turn on your mic?
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
perfectly. Go ahead.
I was just curious, what kind of correlations are there between Indigenous peoples in Canada and what and policies against them that the Canadian government is behind? Even like other, for example, I read about the sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada, and yeah, I was just wondering what's the similarities and differences between what we know anyway. Thank you.
Thanks, Ethan. That brings us to Roy and Abhishek, unless someone else of whom we have not heard yet wishes to step in.
Bob is on the list too, Bob from Kingston.
Okay.
I just didn't know how to lower my hand. I raised it the first time. I don't know how to lower it.
Okay. You've got an aggressive hand there. I hope you could get control of it. Okay, Roy, why don't you go ahead and then we'll go to Abhishek.
Well, I made my position, which is basically seeking for the correct revolutionary strategy for an allegation in another country that the capitalist world is always making. In this case, against the genocide of the population in China. That was my question, and it's troubling. We do read about it all the time in the capitalist press, how in China they're repressing rights and they're doing all this and that. We rarely read how we repress rights as the capitalist world. And the previous discussant just mentioned about Aboriginal rights. But if you want to talk about genocide, if you want to talk about historical abuse, what we did as from the British and from the French came here, and what we did to the Native people did, that needs to be addressed. Our treatment of First Nations people, stealing their land, putting everybody on reserves, denying their culture. I think that's a more important issue than what's happening somewhere else in the world, allegedly. But anyway, I'll leave it at that. That's my position. Barry.
Okay, Roy, that's fine. Thank you very much. Abhishek, do you want to jump in at this point?
Just give me a second. Yeah, Comrade Barry, yeah, I understand that the word genocide has a historical baggage, and I understand that it can't be applied to maybe to the condition of Uyghurs right away. I understand that we have not found the mass graves, we have not seen gas chambers as yet, but we are also looking at how in Nazi Germany it didn't happen overnight. People were not taken overnight, so there were stages to it. So I'm also suggesting that there is a cultural genocide that is happening. I understand Uyghur population in past have had comparatively more civil liberties, but things have started changing since 2014, and things have escalated to such an extent that there are, according to them, there are re-education camps, but these are camps where people are forced to do bonded labor. There are sterilizations happening, there are mass rapes happening. So if it is not cultural genocide, then discrimination of course does happen. Discrimination happens in some of the so-called secular liberal countries as well, but you cannot dismiss what's happening with Uyghurs merely in terms of discrimination. It's much more than that.
Okay, fair enough. Before I go back to Robbie, or maybe make an observation myself, I'm going to ask again if anyone who has not yet spoken or wishes to speak a second time would like to take that opportunity now. Okay, seeing no one, I'm going to toss this in, Robbie, if you don't mind. Today, Justin Trudeau was interviewed on CBC. He was asked the question, you know, the Chinese authorities say Canada should be reluctant to criticize China because of its terrible misconduct in relation to the Indigenous people in the Canadian state. And his response was, well, Canada has a truth and reconciliation process and China doesn't. And that was basically his argument. It's a process. Canada has yet to rectify the oppression of Indigenous people and the extent to which they suffer today with inadequate education, healthcare, clean water in many communities, and worse. And then there's, of course, the pain that is revived by the discovery of the unmarked graves, not only in Kamloops and Brandon, but we fear in dozens and dozens and dozens of the former residential school properties across the Canadian state. There will undoubtedly be thousands of such graves discovered in the weeks and months to come. So Trudeau is a hypocrite, big time. Truth and Reconciliation Commission came up with I think 94 recommendations at least 6 years ago, and the protest against mistreatment of Indigenous people goes back for decades. And still there's a boil water order that applies in many Indigenous communities, and you know, generations have been lost to adequate education and healthcare, and the problem continues. But the resource corporations reap billions of dollars in profits from the resources that they've taken from the lands that were never ceded to them, but are taken in the interest of private profit. The Indigenous people on contact didn't have a private property system. Their lands and resources were held in common. They were, you know, protectors of the lands and waters. And capitalist society is the opposite. The opposite. So Trudeau is not in a position to lecture anyone except in the high art of hypocrisy. Robbie, do you want to wrap up this segment?
Yeah, I think we have to put a lot of emphasis on the deplorable track record in our own country and many other settler colonial states in comparison to China. I mean, the reason Roy made the point that, well, it's not that important, an injustice, or it's maybe an injustice, but it's not that significant. Well, that may be true, but it has a certain political significance now, because it's been taken up by the West as a principle. It's been weaponized by the Western powers as a way of weakening China and mobilizing hostility and aggressive attitudes towards China. So that alone means we can't ignore it. And I'm not sure, you know, we're in the business of weighing, you know, which cases of injustice are worthy of attention. But for political reasons, this is important, and I think we need to take a stand on it. And I think, you know, I agree with Bob from Kingston, who said that 95% of our attention should be directed at opposing our own ruling class and imperialism. But it really does depend on the audience and the time and the place, because I can tell you that if you start in with and dissociating yourself from China and criticizing them, that will be used, of course, by the media and by other political forces to pursue their own aggressive policies. On the other hand, if you're in a group of revolutionary socialists, then you have to have a frank discussion about these things. But I still think that the end result is that we would put the principal emphasis on combating the war drive of our own rulers. So I'll leave it at that.
Can I say something more, Barry?
Well, before you do, Roy, I noticed in the chat, which I'm just looking at now for the first time, pardon me, that Justin Renke concluded a comment with "May I," and that kind of suggests that he'd like to speak. And you're welcome to do so, Justin. Would you like to say a word?
Yeah, sure, if you will humor me.
Absolutely. We welcome you. Go ahead.
All right. So hello, everyone. I'm just going to apologize in advance. It's the end of the day and my meds are wearing off. So I just wanted to note that I agree that genocide is kind of a difficult word that we have to grapple with, but the pace of genocide and the effectiveness of genocide does not matter. It is the intent. And we've seen in Canada, we're so ready as socialists to call out really the low-hanging fruit of Canada and the US being genocidal, but we're hesitant to sort of call out that similar behavior that is being, that China is being accused of. And so I kind of see that perhaps there's even sort of a hesitancy to criticize China where we are happy to criticize the Canadian government and the US government. And just to add on to that, propaganda is extremely strong. When I was in Germany, I was working in a school to as a language resource. And I made it a point to give presentations on Indigenous issues in Canada. And literally at one point I was trying not to cry because it's just so, when you actually know how horrible it is really just disgusting. But they had no idea, absolutely no idea. They thought, oh, we thought Canada was great. We thought this was wonderful. So propaganda is so strong that even if those very, very obvious signs aren't there, it is a systemic approach. And we see that in Canada with the foster care system. And we see that with in the justice system, in poverty, in housing. There's still all of these problems that we can say, yes, that's contributing to continuing genocide. Even though there aren't, you know, like saying there's bodies and bodies piled up and there's misery afoot, you know, everything is a disaster. Well, Indigenous people have rights to fishing and they don't need permits for that. There are certain quote unquote special rights that Indigenous people have over Canadians. Again, a lot of quotes and air quotes around here. So I just kind of maybe wanted to address sort of those points that I was hearing. It seems sort of like maybe some more, there's red herrings going on. And I think as a socialist here, it's kind of a given that we know that Canada and the US and the Western imperialists are horrible. I think at this point, we're kind of wasting our time, honestly, at least amongst ourselves discussing that. But yeah, I'll cut myself off there. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. We're very happy to hear from you and look forward to working with you in Alberta. And I note the message you sent to me, and I look forward to having a conversation. I'm going to give you a call after a big conference I have tomorrow night with the Toronto membership of Socialist Action. Okay, thanks.
Eric, I see that Jason has his hand up. I don't know if you can see him.
Oh, Comrade Jay. Well, I don't see a hand, but I'm happy to call on him.
There is
Jason?
Yeah, hello everybody. Hi, comrades. I just wanted to make a point, your point about Indigenous people. There is a lot that people can learn from the way they used to live, because I would say it was a form of communism. They shared all the things between each other. They all took care of each other, and there's a lot people can learn from that. That's my comment.
That's very true, Jason. In fact, successive Canadian governments have not only attempted to make the Indigenous people disappear, but they have demonstrated how two modes of production are incompatible. They cannot share the land and the resources. The Indigenous people basically did not had a system of common ownership, and the settler society, you know, late feudalism, early capitalism, late capitalism, all characterized by private property and the means of production, and that means they're destined to clash. And they, you know, the governments have introduced, you know, the elected band system so as to coerce Indigenous communities to sell their property to white settlers, to Canadian society members, in the effort to ever shrink the land base that is held and enjoyed by indigenous people. They've been shunted aside and shunted into a corner by the encroachments of the profit system. We defend their rights against these encroachments, against the profit system. And in fact, there will be no reconciliation without restitution. And we in Socialist Challenge believe that a cornerstone of restitution is the nationalization of big oil and gas and the major resource corporations. They have plundered the land, air, and mineral wealth for their own profit, turning many indigenous communities into dumping grounds for waste, toxic waste. You don't have to look much further beyond the Wabigoon River Basin north of Thunder Bay for an example of the effect that's had on the health outcomes for indigenous people who live in that area, north of Kenora, I should say. Also would add that China is certainly a unique society. Some characterize it as state capitalism. I find that kind of an imprecise term, but it does seem to capture the partnership between the Communist Party and foreign and domestic capital. China has the largest collection of billionaires in the world. So who benefits from the China system? If it's a worker state, then we have never seen one like it. Of course, everything is unique. That's almost a commonplace, but certainly there is a burgeoning capitalist class in China, and I think in partnership with the repressive CPC, it controls the means of production for its own enrichment and to expand China's influence into markets, rather than to affect revolutionary social change. The Chinese Revolution of 1949 at least was an expression of revolutionary social change, but it has been curbed and reversed by developments since Deng came to power in the late 70s. Okay, enough from me. Robbie, we have about 3 minutes to the top of the hour. Do you want to wrap up this segment and then we'll go to the business meeting?
Well, I guess the outstanding differences, I don't know how significant they are around the question of whether we could apply the term genocide to the treatment by China of its Uyghur population. I continue to feel that's quite a bit of an overstretch, and you know, there's an emotional aspect to terms like genocide that are very hard to put aside when you're trying to analyze something very concrete. I'm happy to let that discussion sort of continue and be influenced by, you know, the history and further information. I think the biggest thing about this situation in Xinjiang is there's a very little information you can trust. Those aerial photos and so on are, some have said, have been doctored and so on and so forth. There's a big Western propaganda campaign. I have no particular brief for China or the Chinese bureaucracy or the Chinese Communist Party, but I am concerned to get at the truth. And I think it's been very difficult, and it was very difficult in other situations like the war in Syria. So I'm not I'm not going to make excuses or apologies for China, but I'm also wary of invoking words that have a very inflammatory meaning and can be co-opted by the forces that are looking for a showdown with China. So that's one comment that I have, and well, I hope that my presentation was useful, at least to stimulate debate and discussion, and I'm glad to have some differences come out. I don't think they're you know, issues of principle, but more of interpretation and of analysis. So that's about all I have to say.
Thank you, Robbie. Your presentation was very thought-provoking and very well prepared and very factual as far as we're able to get a command of the facts in this issue. We live very far away from the scene of the crime or the scene of the situation that is the subject of tonight's talk. So thank you very much for what you presented. I think it's fair to say that this discussion is not closed. It will be informed as more information becomes available. We in Socialist Action take pride in being open to facts. We want science to apply the facts and to draw conclusions in the interests of humanity. And that means being open, being willing to dialogue and to deal with unique situations. And I think China is certainly one such case. So thanks again, Robbie. So we're just gonna make a transition